I'm tired.
Hi, I'm Radical Liberation, self-declared King of the Moon, here with you for another Econ Mini with Mad Mercenary from Australia.
Hello.
Hi. Let's see. Oh, I left the picture up. There you go. First thing to talk about is the merch store. I just finally bought something from our own merch store for the gym. I've been needing some more workout shirts. So I had to get that Did We Really Win Soviet design, shattered Soviet design that Mad Merc did, which I just really love. So I got one of those for my workout shirt. This is my wife in a Mrs. Red Lib, the Red Lib logo with a Mrs. hidden in there and the top of the R. Anyway, so yeah, merch store is awesome. People order from it. They like the stuff. It's kind of amazing.
There will be further designs going up there, including, yes, and people have DM'd me about this, line go up.
I would love that. Yeah.
Line go up, a few more shattered designs, and
good.
What was that phrase from the other show we did? I can't remember it specifically. I'll have to go back.
To touch a girl, touching a coin is like touching a little girl. Something like that,
yes.
Right? Yes, so you're going to do it. Yes.
We will be having that on the store. I just need a little bit of time. It's been a bit of a hectic couple weeks for me, but
right.
They are going up.
Okay, wow, I'm loving it that you're doing that. Okay, awesome. All right, okay, so that's that. Oh, yeah, before I leave Shilling, I did want to mention that our friend Academic Agent has a sale going on right now for his academic agency. I've been talking about the Trivium because he just finished that, but I guess I thought this week, bring it back home to what this show's about. He has a course called Foundations of Economics. Mad Mercenary. Now, you rather implied this, but you didn't state it categorically. You have completed the course now, Mad Merc?
I have.
Okay, that's what I thought, because you talked about putting it on your... Okay, you talked about putting it on your resume on AA's stream. Anyway, Foundations of Economics, it's good stuff, right, Mad Merc?
It's fantastic stuff. It goes through the foundations of Austrian economics very well, explains very clearly, explains the history behind it, many of the points about interest and price formation, price formation, prices themselves, time preference, human action. Many of these topics are covered in Foundations of Economics. The only complaint I have is that it's so short. It's only 10 lessons. I wanted everything.
Right.
Maybe there will be a Masters of Economics course that AA can release.
Yeah, he seems to be starting with sort of basics and obviously leaving room for him to take it to the next level in future courses. Well, Foundations of Economics, I have to say, is not an entirely cheap course. In fact, Mad Mercenary was able to do it with the helpful support of a generous donor to the show. But it is 25% off right now. If you look in the show description, you'll find a link to his site and the code to get 25% off on any of the courses, by the way, like the Trivium package, which has grammar, he calls it Foundations of Writing, Foundations of Logic, Foundations of Rhetoric, so the Trivium, right? You can get 25% off the Trivium package, which itself is discounted from buying the courses individually. Or, as I wanted to highlight today, you can get the Foundations of Economics course 25% off. And when you see the price, 25% off is a lot of money off. So wanted to mention that. Okay, so let's go right into something fun, and then we'll hit a few articles. And we're going to make today's Econ Mini an actual mini, unlike that one a couple weeks ago that I'll be referencing, which ended up really being kind of a regular show. So let's just hit a few things. So lumber prices are kind of going up. So the internet has had something to say about this. I've shown a few of these before, but I just thought sweep through them all real fast. Piece of plywood through somebody's window. Says was going to go through insurance, but sold the plywood and bought a brand new car.
I'm just amazed at how that plywood was able to slice through not only the glass, but also the front bar, whatever that's called, the side of the car.
Yeah, it almost looks like it did. Yeah, that's crazy. This is like making me think of
sorry guys,
lethal weapon. Lethal weapon.
Yes.
There was anyway.
Someone threw it like
gruesome,
a frisbee.
Yeah. Make plywood cheap again, and the Make America Great Again style hat. U.S. Customs and Border Protection seized estimated street value $1.7 million of lumber. There's gonna be a lot of drug references. Say it again.
A pillar. That's what Lumbar is saying. That is the A pillar. Thank you.
The A pillar. Oh, okay. On the car. Yeah. I put this in as a tweet. I shouldn't have done that. Now I can't expand it. Anyway, it says wood cost to build a deck. Now, I have not fact checked all of the numbers we're going to have in the memes, but I gather they're in the ballpark. Wood cost to build a deck if you use 2,400 board feet. That is a 200 square foot deck. April 2020, $936. April 2021, $3,696. So yeah, that's one thing to emphasize. We'll actually be looking at a chart shortly. When we're talking about lumber prices going up, we're not talking about them going up over the years. We're talking about like the last 12 months. They have gone insane. That is why we're getting these really funny lumber memes. Here's another one. I passed a billionaire on the freeway this morning, and he's got a trailer full of lumber. Let me jump forward. Oh, I like this one. Take me somewhere expensive. And they're having dinner in the lumber yard, right? Or the aisle, the lumber aisle of Home Depot. What else do we have? A car filled with a giant log. It'd be nice to hear the actual story on this. Looks like some crackheads found out how much lumber goes for.
They'll do anything for their fix.
Yep. Here's another one that we ideally would fact check, but it shows $800 worth of lumber in 2018, and the truck is just absolutely loaded down. $800 worth of lumber in 2021, and there's two dozen boards in the back of the truck. Here's one. Fuck armored trucks in 2021. We hit in the lumber shipments.
Yep.
I saw it. I picked that one, but I saw a number of memes that are like, showing pictures of trucks with lumber and saying that's the new bank heist. People with sawmills right now. This is where we cut the product before it goes out to the streets. Lumber prices be like gram bags for sale, $10 or 2 for $15. Freshly shaved pine. Looking at dumpsters and new subdivisions for lumber.
I was about to say, if you want free timber, just go to a tip. Just go to a dumpster. They're usually actually quite needs a little bit of work. So pallets and that sort of stuff, they probably have spray paint on them. But sand that back, you just get some good quality wood there. It's not that expensive. You don't need to pay for anything. You just need to do a little bit of hard work.
Yeah, they give us lumber that pallets that my wife uses to make coops for nothing right now. Because they just receive shipments on these things and they just end up with a bunch of them. So they have been selling them for $2 each or something like that. Nominal charge given the amount of wood you're getting. I'm wondering if that's gonna change, or people are gonna drop shipments off and say, "Where's the last pallet we dropped off? We want it back."
My suspicion is that they would, if it's privately owned tip, they would charge more. But if it's council-owned tip, they wouldn't.
Right. Okay, and then last
in
meme,
relative terms. Thank you.
Meme. The numbers look like they're real, but again, I did not fact check. But notice they start this on March 2020, so just a little over a year ago, and they're saying that for a 3/4 inch plywood standard sheet, $37.98. And then they show the price going up. Actually, by February of this year, it's already nearly doubled to $72. And now April, they're saying it's at $96. And they say this is 252% price increase on one of the most used piece of common lumber for construction. Welcome to the beginning of the end of home ownership. Yeah, so a couple more things on this. Let's switch to, what do I want to go to? Here we go. Let's switch to my browser and a little bit more on the lumber stuff before we get into our other things for today. Yeah, there we go. Well, first of all, let's actually look at the price chart. Now, this is not the price of lumber, right? This is lumber futures, LBS, NASDAQ reporting, though I don't know that the data is coming from them. And I've got this set to 1 year, the 1 year chart. And so, sure enough, lumber futures back in May of 2020, actually, this goes to like April 29th. Yeah, it's 1 year, right? So 1 year ago today, $312 for lumber futures, which gets you, it was something like 1,000 boards or something like that. I don't know. That is now, as of today, at about 1281. The high was actually above that. The 52-week high was quite recently, just 2 weeks ago, at $1,326. So from 300, around a little over 300 to 1,326 American dollars. So that's more. Interestingly, in this video, which I'd like to share the link with y'all, this is really interesting because this, someone sent me, and I'm sorry, I forgot who sent this to me, but thank you so much. I did watch it, and it was interesting. This is actually from someone who does woodworking videos, and he decided to take a little venture into Econ and say, yeah, the lumber prices have been really crazy, so let's talk about that. Here, let me share that. There's that link to that video. It's not long. It's a little over 8 minutes. And he just kind of goes through some of the different demand and supply factors. You know, he talks about sorry, I'm distracted. Give me just a moment.
Well, while Radlib's doing that, potentially what we're looking at here is, again, with all the money printing that's been going on, which we have covered over the last several months, the Cantillon effect coming into full force. Obviously, lumber, being a higher order good, will be affected by the change in the amount of money in the system before other goods, depending on how the money is introduced to the system. So when central banks do QE, quantitative easing, in comparison to when they do direct stimulus checks into everyday Americans' pocketbooks, what we see is that quantitative easing takes a while for money to flow down and through the system, whereas the direct injection of money into everyday Americans' bank accounts is directly affecting consumer goods and not higher order goods immediately. Whereas if money has to work its way down through the system, starting with the financial sector, going into those highest order goods, then the medium order goods to the lower order goods, prices adjust over time. And now, again, depending on how much and how quickly the money is introduced, that can change how large and how harsh the Cantillon effect is. But again, this is just a standard Cantillon effect that we are seeing. Not that it's good. When I say standard, I want to make that very clear. I'm not saying that this is a good thing that's happening. I'm just wanting to state that this is what we would expect to see in economics.
Oh, yeah, I think someone just helped me remind me where this video came from. Let me make sure I'm getting that right. I think it might have been Tragic Vision, who we on Twitter, who shared this video. Anyway, this guy doesn't get into Cantillon effects, right? He's not an economist, but he talks about the slowdown in building in 2020 because, the people got sent home for their jobs, right? Due to initially at least being inessential. And so there was a slowdown in supply on lumber and so on and so forth. He goes through the various demand and supply factors, and he looks out to futures for, I'm not sure what the lumber, the chart I was showing you, what futures those are exactly, because you can have, 30-day futures, 60-day, 90-day, so on and so forth. He looks out a bit and shows that the market is anticipating that supply and demand are going to line up a bit better. And so he sees a price decrease in the anticipated in the futures that are out a bit. I forget, it's like 90-day or more. So he thinks that basically supply might catch up and it'll get a little bit more sane, but it doesn't look like it's going back to where it was a year ago anytime soon from any indication we can see. So anyway, wanted to highlight lumber. Lumber might be an outlier. We've seen some lists of prices, price increases in various sectors, various commodities and so forth, and lumber's at the top of that list. So lumber might have something special going on with it that doesn't tell us the story of price inflation in general across the economy. Go ahead.
Correct. Now, obviously, using Austrian method and laws of logic, we know that at least the Cantillon effect has some effect on the price. But as we know, life is not a laboratory and we cannot isolate for a single factor. Therefore, there could have been some elasticity and pumped up demand from the lockdowns in 2020 that are now being expressed in 2021, now that people are beginning to get out of lockdown and are able to do those construction projects. There could be some truth in that. And that could be contributing, either, we don't know how much, again, life is not a laboratory, but that could also be contributing logically to the price increase. So this man could be very correct. But there could also be other factors that we haven't accounted for that are also playing on the demand and supply of the price. So we have to use laws of logic here, but we don't know exactly how much of what areas and how many areas there are that are affecting the price of lumber. We can only go off what we know.
Sorry, unmuting. Okay, yes, right. So keeping an eye on it, we'll see.
Hopefully that makes sense.
I think your point that lumber is a higher order good, right? You use lumber to make a house, right? And a lot happens before you actually make the purchase of the house, for example. And it's used in a number of other ways. Though, with all the sort of Home Depot references and stuff, some consumers just directly buy lumber to do the work themselves, but probably I would expect the large majority of lumber is being sold to people who are turning it into something that they then sell later. So it's a high order good in that sense. And we do expect that price inflation will end up in the higher order goods first. So it could be a bellwether. It could be a fluke with lumber. That lumber is just that the lumber market itself is experiencing something a little weird. And that's where this video, I think he makes some suggestions that seem plausible, but something to keep our eye on. And of course, it's always fun for it to generate some memes. Okay, so let me turn to another story before the title story of the day. Just wanted to talk a little bit about this article about the U.S. recovery. And he makes a simple point, but I thought it's worth hitting on. We actually spent some time on this. In fact, let me start by, let me share that right away. I've shared the article in the live chat and also this video, which is from 3 weeks ago, where we went through Jesus Huerta de Soto's analysis of the economic effects of pandemics. There we covered some of what he's talking about, but I thought this was a nice little update and comment from a fellow who I gather is someone whose work we should feature a lot. What I've seen from him is really good. And I have no idea how to pronounce his name. I'm going to go with Daniel LaSalle. And he says the U.S. recovery is weak, especially given the size of the stimulus. And he points out that it is true that the United States recovery is stronger than the European or Japanese one. But he says if you look at the macro data, the idea that things are like really awesome is wildly exaggerated. That, as the headline suggests, he does not think this is that exciting of a recovery, especially if you think that the stimulus was meant to give us like an amazing recovery. So one of the things he does in this article, and I hadn't really thought about this, so I appreciated him doing this, is he talks about just how large the stimulus has been. Let me see if I can find that section here. Yeah. Sorry, I should have marked this up like I usually do. That always helps me move faster. Okay, here we go. Yeah, massive chain of stimuli of more than 12% of GDP in fiscal spending and $7 trillion in Federal Reserve balance sheet expansion. Now, this is something, right, Madmerk, that we have been keeping an eye on as we've been looking at the balance sheets, not just of the U.S. Federal Reserve, but we've been looking at the the ECB, right, the European Central Bank, even the Australian Central Bank. And we have been seeing balance sheet expansion across the board throughout the last year. Am I summarizing that correctly?
The amount of stimulus that has been globally injected into the system has been unmatched by previous events. So this is an unprecedented amount of stimulus into the system. This is an unmatched amount of quantitative easing that has been injected into the system. So a couple weeks ago, sorry, not a couple weeks ago, it was probably a month ago now, the Australian Bank announced it was doubling the amount of bonds it was buying, and it was injecting double what it was into the system. The European Union, obviously the ECB, has been heavily aggressive in trying to stimulate the economy, and we went through debt to GDP ratios a couple weeks back with that great website that you brought up. So this is an unprecedented amount of stimulus into the system. We've seen this before with individual countries going through their own crises, but we have never seen this to the extent of every country doing it at the same time for a prolonged period of time. And this is
but
one could murky territory.
One could almost say that they're doing a big experiment on all of us in real time, which feels strangely familiar from other things that are going on. But anyway, so right, that well put, Madmerk, and he compares it, just focusing on the U.S. strictly. He compares it to the stimulus after the 2008 crisis, and says that all of this amounts to 3 times larger than the stimulus after 2008, QE and stimulus and so forth, which I remember at the time, people thought that was really quite insane, right? And now in this last 12 months, they've gone way beyond that. So having highlighted that, this is a really lot of stimulus, he says, given all that, what's the quality of the recovery? And he argues that it's not really very good. He says, no one can talk about a strong recovery when industry capacity utilization is at 74%, massively below the level of 80% at which it was before the pandemic. So we're not back to where we were in terms of making use of our industrial capital, capacity, right? Capital equipment and so forth. Labor participation, forced participation rate stands at 61.5%, significantly below the pre-COVID level. Unemployment is only about 6%, but that's twice as large as before the pandemic. Continuing jobless claims remain above 3.7 million in April 2021. This article, by the way, is just 5 days old, so this is current numbers we're looking at. Right, so people are not all back to work. Industry is not ticking back into action totally, despite this historically unprecedented injection of money. Well, what's going on? I think I'll skip a little and get to what really jumped out to me. Skip to the chase of this. Oh, sorry, one more. We had talked about this, the debt to GDP ratio stuff, but he says, my main concern is that this monster deficit and debt program has been set as the minimum for the next crisis. No one has analyzed if the spending plans have been effective. In fact, in the Eurozone, no one seems to be concerned about the fact that countries that have spent between 20 to 30% of GDP in stimulus plans are now in stagnation. And he says the mainstream message seems to be that if they didn't work, they should have been even bigger, right? Which is just what we always hear from the state. You know, our program didn't work. Well, that's because you guys held us back, and we should have really done a moonshot, you know.
We weren't responsible with the money you already gave us, but if you gave us more money, we will be responsible then.
It'll all work out. Just trust us even more. Yeah. So this is interesting what he says, and I want to be careful here because this is going to trigger a vaccine debate potentially, and I don't think that's what he's up to here, whatever his beliefs about the vaccine may be. His point is the perception and the effects on the economy, right? So he says the number one drivers of the recovery are the vaccine rollout and the reopening of the service sector. That is, in his view, trillions have been squandered. The problem was the virus and the government imposed lockdowns. The solution is the vaccine and the reopening. So what is he saying here? He's saying what really slammed the economy, obviously, was that they shut everything down, you know, right? I mean, that's what caused problems. And he says, so whatever recovery we're seeing is mostly a measure of the extent to which the economy is being allowed to, you know, people are being allowed to get back to work and so forth. And he says he doesn't really think it has hardly anything to do with the stimulus. We don't see a correlation because the whole point here, and this is why I thought this worth highlighting, the whole point he's making is if the stimulus was going to get the economy roaring again, well, where is the recovery? Where is the roaring recovery? We don't have it. We have a sort of limp recovery after just a historically unprecedented, astonishing amount of stimulus. And he says these dots don't connect. What does connect is you do the vaccine and everybody's like, oh, I've got the vaccine. I feel safe working again, or companies feel safe opening again. I bet you there's some liability aspects here, right? Like if you reopen and everyone's vaccinated, then you're like, hey, we got everybody vaccinated. If there's a problem, it's not our fault. You know, it's the vaccine or something. You know, the vaccine wasn't good enough or something, but we did our due diligence, right? Because that's something I've thought about a lot over this past year. How do companies reopen and not get sued when somebody gets COVID at work, right? So there's a huge liability factor here. And that definitely affects how companies behave, in my experience. Strongly affects. So I think the vaccine has less to do with science and more to do with covering people's asses. I think that's what's going on. So that's how I read this. It's not about, you know, we're great believers in Pfizer vaccines or whatever. No. Point is, people have their liability concerns covered. If they say, we're reopening, if you are concerned, if you feel safe taking the vaccine, take it before you return to work. There, boom, liability done. We'll see how it comes out in the courts later, right? When somebody gets COVID when they return to work this year. Okay, so, all right. So I think I shared that. Yes, the economic effects of the pandemics, which is a more thorough coverage of this whole topic of the recovery. But I really liked his perspective on kind of what's going on right now, a little current update. So now, let's go to our main topic. Am I getting my time wrong? Oh, so we should be done in like 12 minutes to stick to the schedule. Is that right?
That is correct.
Oh my goodness. Is that seriously how fast you want this to go?
Well, I don't exactly have a choice. Sorry.
Oh, you are gone in 12 minutes.
I am gone in 12 minutes.
Okay. Well, I might have to go a little bit longer, but let's see how we can do. Okay, let's rock and roll. So the question I raised in the title and in the description of the video is this issue of there being massive increase in M1. In fact, I've got a chart here. Here we go. Let's look at this. Here's the monetary base from the Federal Reserve. And here you can see it spiking up after the 2007, 2008, kind of around that era, right? It spikes up. And then it reaches a high around 2015, a local high. And then recently it spikes up yet again. Boom. Really goes way up dramatically in this last year. So a lot of money.
We can actually see that this chart here is actually a little bit out of date.
Yeah, it's been going up more.
It's been going up more. It's actually above the point that it is. It's above the 5 trillion mark.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah. So it's this chart is out of date. So maybe if we wanted to get we've stopped reporting on M1, haven't we? That was a story.
They stopped reporting. They stopped M1 at the Fed. Yeah.
At the Fed.
Right. Yeah. Anyway, okay. So the point is, I just showed a chart to give you some sense that when we talk about the money supply increasing, we're serious. The money supply has increased. Okay, but the price inflation has not increased as dramatically. Now a commenter who I think has joined us, if I see her in the chat, said, "Hey, haven't you seen food prices and lumber prices?" And I enticed her by saying there will be lumber memes. So that worked, I guess, to get her to join. But anyway, food price increases, lumber price increases. Yeah. Yes, I'm not denying that there's price increases. That's something we're tracking on this show, and we're keeping a sharp eye on this price inflation. But compared to the money supply inflation, it's not tracking. The price inflation is not tracking to the money supply inflation. These things are disjointed. So what's going on? Well, let's look at a couple things and then a key article, or one thing and then a key article from the great Austrian economist Bob Murphy. And it is an article he recommended to me, in fact. So thanks, Bob. So on Zero Hedge, again, very recent stuff we're covering today. This is just 10 days ago. A stunning divergence. Latest bank data reveals something is terminally broken in the financial system. And trying to share my stuff as I go. There you go. There's that article. And while I'm thinking about it, let me share the Bob Murphy so I don't forget, because that's going to be the key article today. Okay, so this is what he's pointing out here, and it is quite interesting. He's looking at J.P. Morgan, which is a key, largest U.S. bank, a key player, right? And in particular, he points out that J.P. Morgan has historically been known for making loans to the broader population. So it's not all B2B; they're making consumer loans, right? And here's what is interesting: their total deposits rose by a whopping 24% year over year, okay, and up 6% from the previous quarter. while the total amount of loans was virtually flat sequentially and down 4% from a year ago. Okay, so why is this surprising? And we'll see more in the Bob Murphy's article. Because usually, if the banks can do it while keeping with their legal reserve requirements and all that, then if they have money to loan, they loan it. That's historically been the case, okay? And that's, I think, what we're seeing here in this chart. Again, this is just focusing on JP Morgan, but it does tell us a broader story that we're seeing across the economy. And you see that these lines are not so divergent back in, what is that? About 20 years ago is where this chart starts. Not so divergent, right? And then more and more divergence. And then in the last year or so, am I reading this right? Yeah. In the last year, we see a real sharp divergence where deposits grow not very much, right? Just a kind of a reasonable growth relative to the last 10 years. I'm sorry, I'm getting this wrong. Reading the lines wrong. Sorry. Deposits go way up at JP Morgan. Loans, essentially, as he said, are like flat. When you look at that last part of the chart, red line goes up, green line does not. It basically stays flat. Well, what's going on right now? Now, why is this interesting? It means that the deposits mean, more money, right? So there's let's take that as a proxy, say, for increase in money supply. But the money's not getting out there, right? Without it being with the bank sitting on it, without it being loaned, it's not going to have an impact on. You're not going to have a hit on price inflation. I think that's the story. I hope I'm getting that right. So let's then turn.
Let's put this into sequential terms. Money is created at the Fed. Fed loans it out to its primary lenders, right? So these are the banks that are assigned the coveted role of receiving the new stimulus first. What usually happens with what quantitative easing is meant to do is that this money is then meant to be injected into the financial system, and it most certainly has. Don't get us wrong. Some of this money has indeed gone into the financial sector. This has been for example, the rise in the value of stocks and bonds. Stocks, bonds are a little bit different these days. Rise in bonds. For goodness sake, it's early in the morning for me. Stocks. Thank you. It's early. The rise in stocks and with the disconnect between the real economy and the financial economy. Obviously, Main Street's been hurting, and the Wall Street's been going up pretty significantly. But what we're trying to point out here is that not all of that has actually been passed on to the financial markets, and then inevitably, as we were talking about with the Cantillon effect, through higher order goods, medium order goods, and lower order goods.
Right.
Some of it is staying in those primary banks and is not being lent out. Now,
this article, Bob Murphy's article, is going to explain one of the reasons why that's happening, which I didn't know. But go ahead, Edmund. Make your point.
Well, thank you. But the potential here, I think, is that as people start to open up, because it's almost like you've had this, not trickle, but you've had a steady stream of stimulus coming in that's been increasing the money supply and increasing inflation and increasing the prices of stocks and higher order goods at this stage. But you still have this giant lump that's being held back. And so the potential here is that as the floodgates get opened, as people go back to work, as people want to take out more loans, you then get this second wind of injection of money into the system that was previously held back. And then that is where potentially where destructive inflation comes from.
Right. Yeah. Right. Right now, you could imagine, as we just discussed, the recovery is pretty limp. And so you don't see maybe the demand for loans that you might get once, everyone feels safe to go back to work and companies are really opening back up and things are getting rocking again, right? And then, maybe all this money that's sitting there in that red line gone up there, we start seeing the green line go up. meaning loans start going out, and then now the money's starting to flow through the system.
And because very similar to a stimulus check, obviously, again, we talked about before, there's a difference between giving money through quantitative easing and giving it through a stimulus check, because one goes directly into the individual's bank account and they use it straight away on consumer goods, and the other has to work its way down through the system. So if this is all being gone out in loans, and remember that JP Morgan here lends to individuals, they're not an investment bank, but they're just a normal bank, then we could see, again, the bypassing of this Cantillon effect and the steep rise in consumer prices of consumer goods.
Right. Yeah, which is, I think when people talk about price inflation, they're talking about going to the grocery store and seeing higher prices, right? That is what in Austrian speak we would talk about as final goods,
Yes,
final or consumer goods. And what people don't tend to pay too much attention to, unless they know Austrian economics, perhaps, is those higher order good prices, because that's where you get the early indicator that it's coming at you in consumer prices. And we have been noting some increases in higher order goods, not just lumber, but other things that go into making things that we eventually buy. Okay, now you are seriously leaving now. Did you have anything you wanted to?
I can stay for 4.5 more minutes.
Okay. Well, is there anything, because I'm going to get into the heat of doing this article, is there anything you wanted to make sure to share with everybody before you have to jump off? This would be a good time to do it.
No, I have nothing to share. Just the fact that merch will be coming. Yeah, just it's been a hectic week for me. So with military stuff, so I'm on to my final stage. So it's
okay. Awesome. And then
yes.
I would say that I would want to mention, just to mention our outside activities is always good, right? And that is that in case you missed it, I want to put this in the stream that Mad Merc was a guest on Academic Agent's wonderful cigar stream series.
Oh yeah, I should probably show that.
I just put the link in there. Do you want to comment real quick?
Yeah, sure. So this is a stream about the Spanish Civil War, the lead up to the Spanish Civil War. It was a very good stream, more politically based, so less economics. Yep. I understand these communities usually have some sort of flow over it, but I just want to make it clear for anyone who's only really here for the economics. This was more of a political stream, and I understand that not everyone shares mine or Radical Liberations or Academic Agents' political views, and that's totally fine. We encourage you to stay here. But yes, that's more of a political stream about the Spanish Civil War, the history behind it, the atrocities that were committed by both sides, and the aftermath of the Civil War. So I encourage you to go have a look. It's a great stream in my opinion. Apostolic Majesty is also there. I saw him in the chat before. Hopefully we might do one on France and de Gaulle at a later stage, but we'll wait and see for that.
Yeah, and I you didn't want to get into it in this Econ Minis, but at some point I was hoping you would expand a little on some comments you made that did have to do with economics. That is, the different economic policies pursued by the different sides in the Spanish Civil War and what the effects of those different policies were. You touched on it briefly because it wasn't the focus of the stream, which was giving a broad history of the Spanish Civil War. But the few hints you gave intrigued me, and I thought it'd be fun to hear a little more on that. So think about returning to the topic, more narrowly focused on the economic policies of the two sides. I think folks would find it rather interesting, is my guess. All right.
Alrighty, thank you very much, guys. I apologize I have to leave early, but again, my life is very hectic at the moment.
Yeah. But these are good, not because of anything bad, though, because of these are good problems, right?
Good problems, yes, good problems.
You're busy, anyway, busy in a good way. Yeah,
busy in a good way. That's a great way to put it. Goodbye.
Okay, bye. All right, so let's turn then to this article by Bob Murphy, which he recommended to me as I was trying to understand some of these things. It's called, it's actually, it's going to become a book. So these are chapters from a forthcoming book that he's, it's like, you know, the serial novels of the 19th century, right? Bob Murphy's like our own Econ version of Charles Dickens or something, right? So this is called Understanding Money Mechanics. And I've been seeing these come out on Mises.org. So I think each draft chapter basically is coming out as an article on Mises.org. And in fact, why don't we just click this link here? And I assume, yeah, there we go. You can see that, oh, it looks like a lot of chapters are already up. And he's sort of filling in some ones in the middle and stuff. Doesn't look like it's been entirely sequential. Okay, so anyway, let me point to that. In fact, here's the table of contents for his whole book. I should probably read all of this because this is an area that I would like to be stronger in. But I enjoyed what I read this time. In fact, I'm going to switch views and do my usual thing that helps me, which is to have a marked up PDF that I can go through. Okay, here we go. So he starts right out where I wanted to focus today. The connection between monetary inflation and price inflation. And he says in a previous chapter, he warned that there is no simple one-to-one relationship. Okay, well, why is that surprising? Because a very simple-minded view of the economy would say that, you know, there's goods to buy and there's a supply of money. And what does money buy you? Well, it's going to be some kind of ratio of the money to each. It's actually a bunch of ratios, right? A ratio of the money to each of the things that money can buy. And if you increase the money supply, then eventually, after Cantillon effects and so forth, the money will buy you less. That is, its purchasing power will go down. If you decrease the money supply, its purchasing power goes up. Or alternatively, and this is what should happen in a healthy, functioning, progressive in the good sense economy, is that the goods and services that you can get for your money improves. So you're, because of productivity improvements and so forth, right? And so let's say it's just a fixed money supply, but the goods and services available for that money supply increase, and so that you can get more for your money. And so this is why we say, and we have observed this historically, that in a healthy economy, you should see a gentle deflation. Nothing catastrophic, but just a gentle deflation where your dollar, your money buys you a little bit more each year because everyone's benefiting from a generally more productive economy, right? So that's the connection that we would normally expect between money inflation and price inflation. You get a bunch more money, you increase in the money supply like we're seeing is happening. Here's the chart I already showed you. And you get an increase in consumer prices, or, you get an increase in prices, working its way through, not all at the same time, as we know, but eventually you're going to see that. But he says the relationship is not so easy. So he says in the early years of quantitative easing, so this would be 10 years ago, many economists, including the present author, meaning Bob Murphy, warned that the Fed's unprecedented monetary inflation would cause a significant increase in consumer prices. Some pundits went so far as to warn of actual hyperinflation and brought up Weimar Germany and modern Zimbabwe, other examples of hyperinflation. Yet, years passed by without the inflation time bomb exploding. In this chapter, he says, we're going to look at several popular explanations for why the Fed's monetary inflation since 2008 hasn't generated a comparable increase in price inflation. So let's be careful here. Yeah, and he says this book is intended to be educational rather than polemical. We're going to give the pros and cons, but we're not going to say that we think this is the right answer. So we're going to go through a number of explanations. It's pretty clear as we look at the pros and cons that some of them Bob does not think are very give us much explanation, right? But they're the explanations that you might have thought of yourself. I know I've seen people in the chat and in super chat suggest some of these things. And he's going to address each one. So I think we'll all learn a lot. So first, there's the problem with the CPI, Consumer Price Index. The government's CPI measure vastly understates price inflation. So as you may know, the Consumer Price Index is this measure that is created by the government. It's not independent, right? And they fiddle with it. They take something out of it because they feel like it's making inflation look worse than they want it to look. So that is, there's some politics. This is not a neutral scientific thing, right? The CPI. There's definitely some politics in this thing. And so, he says, sure, the pro side here is you should be cynical of data produced by government agencies. But there's a problem with this inflation, which is the critics of quantitative easing were warning of significant price inflation. And you're not going to be able to hide that through statistical tricks. He says Americans were able to fill up their vehicles in 2010, and for most drivers, the price was $3 or less per gallon of gasoline. If some of the serious warnings of price inflation proved correct, this would not have been possible. That is, we would have noticed it at the pump and in various other aspects of our life. It would have been in your face. Playing with CPI can't hide a really massive inflation, right? We're all going to know it in our everyday lives. He says now, and he gives an example historically from 1980 where the CPI did show a very large inflation, 14.6%. And he said if they'd tried to lie and say that it was under 2%, everyone would have just laughed and been, we'll ignore the CPI. So yeah, sure, the CPI is a little below maybe what real inflation is, but it isn't like, the CPI says inflation is 1% and really it's 100%. It's not that out of line. So yes, we can't totally trust the CPI, but that can't really explain what's going on here with the disconnect between monetary inflation and price inflation. Next explanation. Inflation won't be a problem while we still suffer from an output gap or idle resources. And he says here we've got both Keynesians and proponents of modern monetary theory saying that increased government spending, even if financed by monetary inflation, won't generate large increases in consumer prices so long as the economy is operating below its capacity. So the idea here is that, like right now, literally there's idle resources. There's people not working that should be working, and there's businesses that shut down that haven't reopened, as we already saw in Daniel LaSalle's article. And so the idea is there won't be a problem because the idle resources will just become active, and we'll just, get more people employed and stuff with the money, as opposed to it showing up in inflation. And he said, to give them their due, the Keynesians and MMT camp were correct when they said the various rounds of QE since 2008 would not cause extreme price inflation, let alone hyperinflation. Since some of their opponents did predict such a result, we can say, the Keynesians and MMTers can say, hey, we're vindicated, right? You guys said there'd be hyperinflation. We haven't seen hyperinflation, so we're right. He says there's some problems with this, though. He says they didn't merely predict a lack of significant price inflation. They predicted price deflation. He cites Paul Krugman, for example, as making that prediction. And so he says in 2009, broadly speaking, the conservative economists predicted accelerating inflation, while the progressive economists predicted accelerating deflation. So neither was right. We didn't get hyperinflation. We didn't get accelerating deflation. And then he talks about how the part of the problem with this story that you don't get inflation until you get to full employment is that it was disproved in the stagflation of the 1970s. The Keynesians, after World War II thought you had to choose between high unemployment or high inflation in consumer prices. It shouldn't have been possible for the economy to suffer both at the same time. But once Richard Nixon killed the last vestiges of the gold standard in 1971, there's that magic year, the remainder of the decade saw unusually high levels of both. So in May 1975, the unemployment rate was 9%, while the 12-month change in CPI was 9.3%. So high unemployment, high inflation simultaneously. The term they made up for it was stagflation. So he says, in light of that experience in the 70s, simple rules such as the economy can't overheat while there are still idle resources can't be the full story. Okay, next. The money supply increased dramatically after mid-2008, but the demand to hold it increased as well. Okay, well, this has some plausibility, right? Based on our show last week where we were really focused on the demand to hold cash, demand for cash, right? What's a reason to hold cash? Because you feel uncertainty. Well, after the 2008 economic troubles, you could see that people would feel more uncertain about the future, be more likely to hold on to money. So yeah, some money's injected, but also people hold it. Maybe they kind of balance out, right? So, there's a certain plausibility here. He says, if we hold the demand for money constant and vastly increase its supply, like with a bunch of quantitative easing, then the price of money falls, meaning the currency becomes weaker, meaning that the price of goods and services quoted in that money go up, meaning price inflation, right? In practice, other things might not remain equal, however, and the demand for money might increase also. So you see the plausibility. He says, we didn't observe an unusual drop in the purchasing power of the US dollar. The dollar didn't get weaker, right? It didn't get a bunch of price inflation from 2008 onward. We can say that the demand to hold dollars increased to offset the increase in US dollars orchestrated by the Federal Reserve. And his critique here is just that the downside of this explanation is that we can only be sure to apply it correctly in hindsight. And he says that, so the problem is we have to get the supply and the demand side, right? So we can look at the money supply going up, but to really figure out whether it'll result in price inflation, we got to figure out if people are going to demand to hold more money. And the problem here is changes in the money supply can directly cause an increase in the demand to hold it, okay? So here's the next proposal. Of course, quantitative easing wasn't inflationary. The economy was stuck in a liquidity trap. The Fed's bond purchases were just an asset swap. Now, I'll admit, at this part of the article, my ignorance of Keynesian thinking starts to get me feeling a little bit lost, but I'll do what I can here. He says, so the benefit of the explanation is that it's an important caveat to a naive supply and demand analysis. It would be foolish to focus merely on increases in the supply of money if the very process that created the money also boosted the demand for cash by removing near money substitutes dollar for dollar. Right, so he says that when they did this quantitative easing, they basically took treasuries off the market, which are considered a near money, which we discussed last week, right, in talking about secondary media of exchange. T-bills would be one of those things that people feel is very safe, liquid. It's a great place to park things if you don't want to hold it in cash itself, right? And he's saying, so they're basically a $10 billion purchase injected $10 billion of base money into the financial sector, but it simultaneously removed $10 billion of near money. So it's swapping things that are very close to each other in practical action, right? More cash, but less T-bills. And he says they create the money, but they boost the demand for it because they're removing the near money substitutes dollar for dollar. So there's less T-bills for me to park my money in. So there's more of a demand just to have cash, right? Or other secondary media of exchange, as we discussed last week. He says the downside of this analysis is that it ignores central bank policy the influence central bank policy has on asset prices. So his exaggerated example is that the Fed announces a new plan of buying any model year 2010 Ford pickup truck for $100,000. This would immediately cause the market price of such trucks to jump to $100,000 because you know that the Federal Reserve will pay $100,000, right? So you could say the Fed's engaging in a mere asset swap. It provides $100,000 in new bank reserves in exchange for a truck, which is now valued at $100,000. But the problem, of course, is it totally distorts the market because this is sort of a fake price, or it's a fake price, right? They've just declared that trucks are worth $100,000. So it's going to distort the used vehicle market. It's going to financially benefit 2010 Ford trucks, which are basically getting like a little small lottery ticket that has really nothing to do with market supply and demand, but just government intervention. So even though at the moment of purchasing treasury bonds, the Fed is engaging in an asset swap, the market price of those treasury bonds might be propped up by the Fed's purchase itself. Now, this is where we get to this issue of, back to this issue of the loans and the deposits diverging. And I thought, I did not know this, and I thought this was really helpful. So the Fed's new policy of paying interest on reserves arrested the usual money multiplier. So they have this new policy of paying interest on reserves. What does that mean? From an individual commercial bank's perspective, the interest payment offered an incentive to refrain from making new loans to customers. So why did the loans stop? Or, why, they get the deposits, but they don't loan them out? Well, because now the Fed is paying them to keep them in reserve. So this is more fiddling from above, right? Even though commercial banks had the legal ability to pyramid trillions of dollars of newly created loans on top of the Fed's injections, they largely remained on the sidelines. And that's what we've seen, right? So this is a chart of excess reserves of depository institutions. What is an excess reserve? Well, there's reserves that they're just legally required to have. So they're always going to, that's the zero line, right? They just have to have that. An excess reserve is they're not legally required to keep this, to have their, ratio of reserves to be supposedly a sound bank. Hint, none of them are sound. But anyway, they're supposed to have some legally required reserve. But then they get more deposits and they don't loan them out. So he says, prior to the financial crisis, it was typical for the banking system as a whole to be nearly fully loaned up, meaning that excess reserves were about $0. And in fact, I see no bumps from 1985 above the zero line at all until 2008, 2009. He says, after 2008, as the Fed injected new reserves into the system through its 3 rounds of QE, the commercial banks did not lend out several multiples of these new reserves, as you might expect. They had these huge excess reserves. He says at the local peak in mid-2014, excess reserves were just shy of $2.7 trillion. So could it explain the pattern? He says, when trying to understand their loan activity, this new policy is definitely an important consideration. However, when answering the question, why didn't the Fed's quantitative easing programs cause significant consumer price inflation, the new policy of interest on reserves seems inadequate to bear the full weight of the explanation. And the reason is that the interest rate paid was not very much. Okay. He says the interest rate paid on excess reserves settled at 0.25% by mid-December 2008. It stayed at that near zero level for a full 7 years, being raised to 0.5% in mid-December 2015. So that doesn't really sound like that's a strong reason to keep it. So it seems unlikely that a mere 25 basis points, 0.25%, can explain why nearly $2.7 trillion in excess reserves piled up in the banking system rather than being funneled into new loans. Okay, next. The new money stayed bottled up in the banks and never got out into the hands of the public. He says, this is correct. It takes note of the huge increase in excess reserves. It fails to account for the fact that M1 did begin a rapid increase in the wake of the financial crisis. So the idea here is the banks just held on to all this for whatever reason. They didn't loan it out, right? As we see with these excess reserves. They held on to it, and so the money supply stayed steady. And he says the problem with that story is it didn't stay steady. As we mentioned right at the top, the money stock shot up, has been shooting up dramatically since 2008, and really dramatically in the last year. We can't explain the lack of high CPI inflation by claiming there was no new money held by the public, because this simply isn't true. There is money out there. Okay, next story then. The new money went into the stock market, real estate, commodities, not into real retail goods. So people got that money and they bought a stock. He says, well, think this through. It is not the case that some money is in the stock market while other portions of the money stock are in consumer goods. He says if someone buys 100 shares of a stock at $10 per share, it's not that money goes into the stock market. What happens is that $1,000 is debited from the checking account of the buyer, while an equal amount is credited to the checking account of the seller. So that means it's neutral in regards to the money supply, right? $1,000 in, $1,000 out. The stock ownership has changed hands, but the effect on the money supply is nil in that case. So that doesn't really make sense. And then finally, he says, those warnings of significant price inflation will eventually be proven right. And this is the thing that we're concerned about. But we'll see, right? He gives an example here. During the housing bubble years in the early and mid-2000s, a growing number of alarmists warned that home prices were rising to absurd levels and that Americans should prepare for a giant crash in real estate and stocks. While the bubble was still inflating, the conventional wisdom dismissed these warnings as baseless fear-mongering. It was only after the crash that most people recognized that the doomsayers had been correct. And I do remember this, that Austrians were feeling very concerned back then, before it happened. And people were saying, coming up with stories to explain why these real estate prices somehow made sense. And that it made sense to take, an interest-only loan so that you could buy a house and then flip it because the prices just kept going up, right? So you were just holding it long enough to sell it again at a higher real estate price because it was just going to be up and up forever. And then finally they crashed, right? But as he said, the alarmists were saying this in the early and mid 2000s, and the crash didn't happen until, late 2007, 2008. It was something like that, I think. So some years later. So the timing is really hard to get. And in fact, though Austrians have had a remarkable track record, as Mark Thornton documents in his book on the skyscraper curse, they've had a remarkable track record of being sort of prophetic here. They can't really name the day and the hour. They see the structural problem. They see that there's going to be a consequence, maybe even pretty much what the consequence will be, but it's hard to time it. If you could time it, all Austrians would be rich, right? Timing it is not something that economics can necessarily give us. So he says, if it happens, that the US dollar crashes against other currencies, interest rates on treasuries spike, official CPI, inflation rises well above the Fed's target of 2%, then the early critics of these policies could say, we were right about the impact, just not about the timing. On the downside, the problem with this explanation is that most of those warning of significant price inflation led their audiences to believe that it would be hitting within a few years at the latest. If they had coupled their initial warnings with the caveat, CPI inflation won't be a problem for a decade, but then it will get out of hand, then it might be different, right? So one thing to take away from this is a couple things to take away from this is that first, you shouldn't look to Austrian economists or any economists as being prophets, stock pickers, so to speak, or downturn pickers, because if they were, then like I said, they'd all be rich. All Austrian economists would be billionaires by now, right? Because they would have been able to play the downturns over the last 100 years, starting with the one that was first predicted by both Mises and Hayek, the 1929 stock market crash. But in fact, even with having a good analysis of the economy, you can't get the timing quite right. So you can say, hey, I see trouble coming, but it's hard. It could be later this year. It could be in a couple of years. It could be in, 7 or 8 years, like with the real estate problems, the real estate crash in 2007. It could be longer. So it's hard to say when it will hit. The other thing to take away from this is that we learned about a number of sources that break that connection, that intuitive connection between an increase in the money supply and an increase in prices. So you can have an increase in the money supply, and the banks just hold on to it and don't loan it out, and you don't get that multiplier, the famous Keynesian multiplier, right? You don't get the multiplier effect because the banks just sit on it. And then a number of other things he pointed to. So that is the main article I wanted to highlight. Let me share it one more time so you can look at it yourself if you like. It's not that long. What else did I want to share? Oh, yeah. I just wanted to point to last week's show because I sent this to Bob. I don't know that he's had a chance to reply yet. Let's see. No, I don't think so. I suggested that one thing that maybe he didn't highlight is what we covered last week. In fact, let me go back to sharing my screen real quick here. Yeah, so this is the show from last week with Christopher Hansen, and we went through his paper that he just presented at the Mises Institute a month ago on secondary media of exchange, and pointed out how when people feel that the money is not very good, it's not a good idea to hold on to, say, US dollars or euros, because we can see that they're inflating the value of this money away. And so it's not a great way to hold on, not a great way to preserve wealth, right? Is just sit there on a big pile of US dollars or euros or whatever. So when the money's bad, there are all near money substitutes, quasi money or secondary medium of exchange, or near money, as Bob put it. Seems like the Austrians have not agreed on a term here. I like quasi money. That's my vote. Quasi money would be gold, treasury bills, perhaps Bitcoin is in this, more and more getting into this category. It's something where it's not so much I use it exactly as money. I don't go to the grocery store and buy my groceries with gold or with Bitcoin. But I can buy some gold or Bitcoin, sit on it, and then when I do need to spend, I can fairly easily, because these are pretty liquid, right? I can find a buyer for my gold. I can generally find a buyer for my Bitcoin. I can pretty easily liquidate a little bit of it. And by a little bit, I mean, say $500 or something, so you're not swamped by transaction costs. Liquidate some of it, or turned into cash, and then I can use the cash to make my purchases, right? But in the meantime, the gold historically has kept its value better than fiat money. And Bitcoin seems to be steadily increasing in value, though it's a wild ride that makes some people feel rather uncomfortable, right? And then T-bills has been considered sort of a gold standard of has been considered a major way to keep your money safe. You put in a T-bill, and the whole U.S. government would have to collapse for it to be no good. Austrians don't tend to recommend T-bills, nevertheless, for other reasons, but it's so far it's been a relatively sensible thing to do. So anyway, I think I shared that link. Yeah, I shared, or did I? Yes, I shared the link to this show from last week, and I think you'd find it of great interest to help you understand a little bit of another factor of where why the money inflation might not result in price inflation, because people, instead of holding a bunch of cash, they holding on to cash to deal with uncertainty. They instead move into gold or Bitcoin or T-bills or one of these other quasi-monies. So I think that is all I wanted to cover for today. Maybe sort of close to a proper mini for once. Let me just pull up any super chats and let's wrap up. Okay, I think we just have one. Yeah, we have one super chat from Jedi Knight Anakin Cringewalker. When money goes down, do stocks drop or rise? Let me think. So money supply. Right. So this is just off the top of my head, but it seems to me that you're going to, from the point of view of the money supply, stocks are just going to be like other, commodities, right? So in a general price inflation, assuming there's not a stock market crash, people still value a share of Apple as much as they did before. Then if the money supply, doubles, then the dollar price of that stock of Apple will basically double or somewhere in the region of doubling. Because, as we said, these changes, there's Cantillon effects, and they don't all the prices don't change all at the same time in the same way. It sort of ripples through the economy in somewhat unpredictable ways. So if the money goes down, stock prices would drop, I guess is what I'm suggesting. But I could be wrong. So happy to have someone teach me. Okay, I think we are done for today. I wish I could announce next week's topic, but I'm struggling to be that organized. I can tell you this, though. I've been writing down my list of guests that I lined up from the Mises Institute, like Christopher, and some others, and then other guests that I've been getting to agree to come on. And so we're not going to try to do a guest every time. I could for a while because I've got quite a nice queue of that. But we do have a number of guests lined up that I'm really excited about. That we'll touch on some of the topics we've touched on and even open at least one or two more topics that we haven't really gotten into ever on the show that I think are going to be of great interest to the audience. So I'm looking forward to that. And that is all for this week, and look to seeing you all next week.